place, there was always a question whether medicine had any efficacy at all
Right.
as a magician.
Yeah, it's not, you know,
But it's interesting how if you introduce the idea of magic into a work of fiction, most people believe that that magic has efficacy. Most readers, and come to think of it, I do too. That is, I know that if a sorcerer's work, and either a contemporary work or something ancient, that somehow what happens will be linked to that practice of magic. And with Medicine Ed, I think the first moment that I really thought I had something was when it came to me. Not only is he going to have this goofer powder that he throws, but he's going to know that every time he uses it, okay, at least in his expectation, the horse will win, but win for the last time. Something bad will follow. And that just, I just got very excited, because then I had that proper mythy folktale kind of bottom to the story that is what I'm usually looking for before I can get completely excited about a plot.
Well, you learned some from grooms. You said African American grooms that you talked to later, in a later permutation of the book, I think. And it was a short story too, right? A night's work, and was in...
A night's work, right. Although a night's work, although I'm so lazy in some part of me, I fully expected to use a night's work, that is to bring the novel around the short story so I wouldn't have to write that 20 pages. But I did, I never managed to do it. It just doesn't quite fit in. Kid Stuff, the blacksmith, who is important but not one of the point of view characters in Lord of Misrule, is an important character in the short story. And his girlfriend, Nurse Pigeon, a licensed practical nurse who he has owed lots of money to over the years. And Tutai is very important. Tutai,
in
the
the
loan
story,
shark.
in the story, yes.
Yes. Of the one character who became a point of view character in the novel, who I had intact by the time I finished the short story, was Tutai.
I love that character. He's so full of guilt and tries to take care of things, especially his dog. Now, you write about some of your other books. This one is based on some things that happened to you, and I think your other books, some of them, you use people from your lives, including yourself. And so one time, if I didn't imagine it, I read in an interview with Barbara Kingsolver that she said she never writes about people she's met or bases fiction on people she's met because it's always exploitative. How do you, I know you write about your sister some, or base some stories on things that, at least things that happened to her and that happened to you. How do you feel about that remark? Do you think it's always exploitative in some way, or?
Probably, I had a very good quotation about that from someone. I can't remember exactly where. It was basically like, what, if you don't want somebody in your life who's probably going to make use of shared experience, then don't get involved with a writer, because what else do writers have, really? Maybe Barbara Kingsolver is really that virtuous. Maybe she's just discreet.
Right, or maybe I might be remembering it wrong too.
Another thing I would like to say, that even if I purported to write about real people, even if I kidded myself that I was writing about real people, I think that it's my nature to turn my experience into narrative almost before it's happened. That's just how I am, and I've spent a lot more time living my life than some writers. Some writers are at work every day being writers. They live more quiet, retiring lives than I lived, at least as a young woman. I think I very easily saw myself as in a story in some way, and yet the characters who are based on a young woman, something like the person I was. That is Maggie in Lord of Misrule, Jane in She Drove Without Stopping, and even to some extent the the protagonist of Bogeywoman, who's not exactly the same type, but she's plenty rambunctious and reckless and so forth. They are always much more simple in a certain way, much more monolithic in what they are than any real person. God knows,
Right.
I couldn't possibly understand myself, I think, in such, not my real self, as anything as easy to isolate as a single character in a work of fiction. And
Or your sister either.
or my sister
Right.
either. No. The amazing thing about my sister is that she still speaks to me that I ever borrowed anything from her life, But she's an artist herself, and I think she gets it. These are always hybrids. They're always as much a product of the imagination that perceives them as of anything that
Right,
we really
as
are
anything
imitating
real.
from real life.
And you said it was a social novel, and it seems like the character of Maggie, especially the sexual freedom of the late 60s and early 70s, which is almost forgotten now
Isn't
with
that
AIDS
funny?
and
Yeah.
all the things that have changed in the political climate. It was really nice to see the sex treated not casually, but that she doesn't feel like she has to marry him, and I think it is very much, it portrays that time and how a young woman at that time might have felt, gotten involved in casual affairs and things. Some people
I know that
I've
would
read
still
have offended, are offended by the sex in the book, but I think that's really an important part of it if it is a social novel that you wanted.
Well, I've always been interested in writing about sex one way or another, and say not afraid to go there, even though I know that a lot of women writers like to be a little more discreet about the physical act. And for some reason, I've never had that inhibition, and I used to. My cheeks flamed a lot more before I won the National Book Award, I'll tell you that. It really helped to have that endorsement, shall we say. But the sex in Lord of Misrule, as you know, is kind of dark. There definitely is some dominance going on, some sex that, although Maggie is a very willing partner in it, is kind of theatrically sadistic, and I saw myself doing that. I thought, why am I, why should I stress that side or choose that particular expression of sexuality for this book? I had to really think about this in hindsight once I had finished it, and I realized because the racetrack is all about coercion. It's all about tying up. It's all about, there's never a horse on the racetrack without at least a halter. The most important tool of control on the racetrack is the shank, just a leather strap with a chain on the end of it. The simplest form of control of a horse happens inside of every stall. There are tie chains. That is, there are
Right.
chains that come from
Hold them on.
from each cheek piece, and it just seemed natural that and besides the idea of tying, what ties anything to anything else? What binds people to each other? What makes any human connection? Is such an important philosophical question in the book. And then it's all happening on a physical level with the horses all the time. With the horses, we see what's tying them up: chains and reins and bridles and bits and so forth are tying them up. So it kind of seemed natural to move from a world where coercion of the willing, because the wonderful thing about racehorses is, we have bred them to do very willingly, in the case of any gifted racehorse, what we ask of them, which is to run faster than is really good for them, and to respond to handling that will help them to do that. So in some way, it just seemed like the right.
It does. It seems like it really fits, and yet, even though you feel like Tommy, in a way, she binds him. He binds her more physically, maybe, than sexually, but in a way, sexually, she has control over him. Of course, he's very vulnerable because of his emotion,
Exactly. No, I think that's true.
But it's sort of a nice
when he says that
repercussion.
it will be all over for him if Maggie leaves him, I think he actually, he is reading the future.
And in a way, they are twins, I think. He talks about twins a lot.
Yeah.
In a way, it seems like they are. What about, I don't want to forget to ask you about writers who have influenced you, because I know people are interested in whose writing do you admire, or who do you read that maybe you get ideas from or are influenced by. Anybody from childhood on, West Virginia or otherwise, writers that you like?
Of West Virginia writers, well, I do love Jane Ann's work.
Jane Ann Phillips.
Jane Ann is a terrific writer, actually. Brees Pancake was a terrific writer in his time.
Now,
Sorry,
Mary Lee Settle, have you?
Oh, of course.
You've met her, I know.
hope we can edit this section. Let's go back to the beginning of that. Well, Mary Lee Settle is not only a terrific writer, but she's all about voice. I mean, there are any number of things that can be learned from reading Mary Lee Settle, reading her own work, reading what she has to say about her work, and reading what other people have to say about her, because she was such an amazing personality, so sure of herself. I did actually have the wonderful experience of meeting her. I was invited to read at LSU, and I was added late to a program in which she was already reading, and when she heard that, she said to my friend Kate Daniels, who was running the series, "Don't make that poor young woman read with me. I'll blow her out of the water." And she did. I mean, she was.
I've never heard her read.
Oh, she was great. She was great. But I think that I surprised her and I think I read a West Virginia section of She Drove Without Stopping, which was plenty upfront in the kinds of things that always interested her. So I think that actually it was a good meeting. I was so glad. I felt so privileged. And for how to handle dialect, for how to handle historical writing, she is as good a handbook as you could imagine. In fact, I just read something in an interview with the Florida writer Janet Burroway about her lately. She must have learned this from Mary Lee Settle somewhere along the line, because she was really quoting her. She said that Mary Lee Settle had the idea that if you were writing about a historical period, you should not take any notes at all when you read the big historical texts, the interpretation of that time in the voice of somebody of your time. Just read that to get a general impression, but don't allow yourself to get carried away with the note-taking side of research. Hold that for when you read the primary sources from that period. And I completely agree with her about that. That is, it's the voices of the time, the letters, the reminiscences, the drama, whatever you have to read in order to look at the art of the period by people of that time in their own voices.